Hello. So, fascism is a word which is being bandied about a lot, and it's questionable about whether people who use it actually know what they're talking about sometimes. So, I want to talk a little about fascism. Um, so, in ancient Rome, there was what was called a fasces. It's Fasces, I believe it's spelled. Not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Um, Basically, there's the idea, I can break a stick. I'm not going to break my paintbrush, but I can easily break a stick. A group of sticks, harder to break. And that's sort of the basic philosophy behind the fasces was it was a battle axe with a bunch of sticks surrounding its handle and sort of tied in a bundle. And it was a symbol of strength through unity and all the other great stuff that we hear in fascist slogans if we study our early 20th century history. We can see all this stuff. Um, so fascism started using this as their symbol. Basically, the Great Depression, things were bad, political, people decided to use the Great Depression as a means of advancing their political goals because people wanted stuff. People were desperate for good government and for stability, and so anyone who wanted to could come along and say, "Look, I've got the answer for you," and people would fall for it. Not all of them were fascists, but it was, and not everyone fell for it, but it was a lead-in, let's say, for fascism. And so the fascists used the concept of the fasces, and they said, look, we got to be united if we want to get out of this problem. And yeah, I believe that, being united helps you get out of problems. United we stand, divided we fall. That's American concept. However, what the leaders didn't explain to them was unity means follow our instructions without question. And so we sort of get away from the united we stand, divided we fall policy with that because, United States, when they said that, they made it temporary, and the fascist nations, the nations that ran under fascism, did not. Uh, so, uh, fascism, like I said, Great Depression, it sort of picked up. World War II, it still existed. After World War II, the fascist nations were basically defeated. It did not go away completely. There were still fascist parties around. They were just very small, and people didn't take them overly seriously. Actually, I think there are still, you could probably look up, there are still fascist parties around. To find out about them, you'd basically have to read their website because no one else talks about them. It's such an unpopular thing that self-identifying as a fascist these days, no one's going to take you seriously. Um, but still, today now, people self-identifying as a fascist, people won't take you seriously. But again, people want to call other people fascists all the time. It's great political rhetoric if you can convince everyone that your political enemy is a fascist and you are not, even though the exact opposite might be true. Um, it's not my intent here to accuse anyone of being a fascist, but I just want to discuss it and give people a chance to, make their own decisions in the future. So looking around, the fasces, before I forget, if you look up some old political posters from the 1930s, 1940s, some of them will have a little battle axe down in the corner, and it's the fasces. That's the symbol that the fascist party chose. So, modern day, back in 2003, a man named Lawrence Britt wrote an article called Fascism, Anyone. He was a political scientist, according to what I could find out about him. And this sort of, he basically was talking about the rise in fascism that he saw going on around him. And he gave, I believe, 14 points about what he considers to be fascist. Since then, the rest of the world has sort of picked up on his 14 points, and these are sort of what most people define fascism as. I disagree with him on some of these. Some of these I believe that basically he looked at the nations that did self-identify as fascist back in the 30s and 40s, picked aspects of them out, ignored the fact that these aspects existed in non-fascist countries, and so, like I said, what he's saying is a sign of fascism actually existed in other countries, and it wasn't necessarily. Fascists did it, but other people did too. So that's my biggest criticism of what I've read about him so far. Other than that, like I said, he's welcome to his opinions, and from what I could find out about him, he wasn't being overly critical about any one person, and the people who want to quote him are really misapplying some of what he said. So I don't want to criticize him because he's not really at fault for the problems. He can't control how people use his writings. So again, I'm going to go through his 14 points. I believe there are 14 of them. I could be wrong. Could have miscounted. Again, understand that I am personally defining fascism as a call for unity, where unity just means obey us. And if you don't obey us, then you're not being united, and we are going to get you for it. So first, powerful and continuing nationalism. I disagree with this one. Back during the 30s and 40s, most of the world was nationalist, whether they were fascist or not. United States was slow to get into World War I and World War II because we were nationalists. We were one of the most strong nationalist nations in the world. So just being, I would hope, nationalism is basically putting your country first. And I would hope that the leaders of America would put America first. Doesn't mean you can't work with the rest of the world. Doesn't mean that occasionally we won't make a deal where we come out on the bottom. But for the most part, you should be looking at your nation's, all world leaders should be looking out for their own nation's interests over the interests of others, in my opinion. Doesn't mean we can't find a global solution, but, by global, what do you mean by global? A European solution we might be able to find easier than a global solution because Europeans have a lot more in common than the entire world does, so we can, someone's going to say I was being racist for saying that, but no, it's more culture and customs and religion and stuff like that. We've got more in common with the other European nations than we do with, the Middle East, the Far East, stuff like that. It's a cultural thing, not a racial thing. Okay, second, disdain for recognition of human rights. That one I agree with. My one question with that would be, what is a human right? The definition of human rights has changed. I would argue that trying to force people to accept some things as human rights that weren't human rights 100 years ago might itself be a form of fascism. It's it all depends on the arguments you're going to use to support your cause. And a lot of people, I don't want to see people get hurt. I believe in human rights. But, telling me I have to accept some things based on a bad argument, I'm going to say that's more fascist than my saying I don't accept the things you want me to accept. As long as I'm not hurting anyone with my beliefs, then I would say I'm not being a fascist for not accepting something, a perceived human right. Like I said, there are some human rights everyone agrees on. There are other human rights that only a few people agree on. Identification of enemies / scapegoats as unifying cause. I put a question mark next to that one. I sort of agree with it. I sort of disagree with it. So, identification of enemies as a unifying cause. I mean, that's sort of a part of nationalism. You want to keep the nation strong from its enemies. Scapegoats, yes, that is a fascist thing. And, claiming someone's an enemy when they're not really an enemy and stuff like that. Yes, that's where we get into fascism. My own other objection to this is he limits it to enemies / scapegoats. There are other unifying causes that can be used for fascism. Some environmentalists are fascists. I want to protect the environment. I want clean air. I want all this stuff. But I don't necessarily agree with your method of doing it. And if you're trying to make me agree with you 100% or else, you're a fascist. Your unifying cause is not an enemy. It is a environmental cause. In like manner, also, how do you identify enemies? There are some people who anything the other political party says is wrong. They are they aren't our enemies, but they are wrong and they are fascist. Well, that makes you a fascist. You're trying to unite people around a enemy. You don't call them an enemy, but by action you are treating them as an enemy. So yes, by this definition, that would make you a fascist. So you gotta be careful about how you define some things. Again, when if Lawrence Britt was looking at nations from the 30s and 40s, then yes, they did strongly do this, and it makes his inclusion of this on the list makes perfect sense. If you're going to talk in more generic terms, you got to be careful about how you do it. Supremacy of the military. Now this one I got to be careful with. So again, having a strong military is not a bad thing. This is part of defending the nation, part of nationalism, which again isn't itself a bad thing. It is the supremacy of the military which makes things, get into fascism here. And basically using the military as a police state and stuff like that, which again happened back in the 30s and 40s with the countries that self-identified as fascist. So for that one, I agree with him for the most part, but he's got to be a little more careful about how he defines supremacy of the military, because just supporting a strong military does not make you a fascist of and by itself. It is giving the military supremacy, giving them power over other people, which makes it more fascist. Rampant sexualism, or sexism. Disagree with that one on completely. Go back 30s and 40s. By modern definitions, most nations were sexist. The United States was a sexist nation back in the 30s and 40s. Now, we allowed for women's rights movements and suffragism and stuff like that. People made fun of it. We were still sexist about it. We still laughed at them. But we allowed them to exist. We allowed them to hold meetings, etc., etc. Some of your more fascist nations didn't allow that much. So, in that sense of it, yes, it would be a sign of fascism. But just saying sexism of and by itself is a sign of fascism, again, most nations were sexist by modern day standards back when fascist nations were in power, or had power, or fascists had power in their nations, I guess I should say. Controlled mass media. Agree with that one 100%. Propaganda is a big tool of fascism, so controlling the mass media, definitely part of it. Obsession with national security. This sort of goes back to nationalism and the strong military. what is considered a threat to the national security, I guess, is my question on this one. You know, the Jews are a problem. Yes, identifying the Jews as a threat to national security did make not did help identify Nazi Germany as fascist. Nazi was the political party. They identified as fascist. The world identified them as fascist. So I am not being contradictory when I say that. Religion and government are intertwined. I gotta question that one strongly. Now, fascism, most people, the first thing that comes to mind is Mussolini, fascist Italy. Pretty much can't kick the Catholic Church out of Italy. I mean, I guess it could be done. It would be hard to do. It would be hard to keep the support of the people if you did it. So, very difficult. So, yes, Mussolini had to at least pay lip service to religion. But again, Nazi Germany, they didn't squash religion, but they were strongly against it in many aspects. And it wasn't just the Jews; it was churches and anything that might take away from the power of the government was frowned upon. Again, communist states, that came afterwards were largely atheistic. We don't typically call them fascist, but some of them could have been, could have been better called fascist than most modern people are being called fascist today. So, some of them, the basic, Marxism was the People's Party, the Workers' Party, and so it was unify the workers, and we will be, we will be one, we will be happy, we will whatever. And then unity meant the government gets to take away your stuff and give you what it thinks you deserve. So, like I said, while we don't typically think of communism as fascism, its early days were fascist in nature, by my definition of fascism, which again, remember, my definition of fascism is a call for unity where unity means obey or else. Corporate power is protected. That one I've got to question a little. So, fascists aren't necessarily against corporations. However, they like to be strongly in control of the corporations. I mean, it's the corporations are fine as long as they're under the government's thumb. So, if you mean protection of corporate power is as a sign of protection of state control of corporations, I would agree. Saying though that fascists are all pro-corporate, as long as corporations have some freedom to act on their own, fascists would be against it. Labor power is suppressed. I will agree with that for the most part. Interesting, while I was looking up posters for fascism, there is power in a union was one of the posters I found. It was basically, a fascist using, labor union jargon to get people to support it. I'm not saying all modern day labor unions are fascist, but watching some of them get involved in politics, it's like, are you really out for what's best for your people, or are you using their money to support things which you like and they necessarily don't? I've asked a few people who work for unions, when the union announces support for a candidate, do they ever ask your opinion? And the answer is overwhelmingly no. So, labor unions, I'm not saying labor unions are fascist, but it was sort of funny to see this poster of, fascists using the unions to support them. Da, da, da. Disdain for intellectuals and the arts. Now, for this one, how are you defining intellectuals and the arts? Modern day fascists like to use scientific claims. Most of the people making these claims aren't scientists themselves and have clearly not studied up on what they're talking about. So, what are you calling an intellectual? I have a college degree. I don't consider myself an intellectual. I went to college. I then went to work. I didn't further my college career. It was, the education was good to have, but it didn't make me smarter than anyone else for any particular reason. I didn't continue my education to where I was smarter than anyone else. So I don't consider myself an intellectual. I like to study. I like to question things, and that's what I'm doing now. But I don't think that my thoughts are better than anyone else's necessarily, unless I can really prove them to be, which sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. I often say, this is my opinion, or this is speculation on my part, because I don't know everything. I'm not an intellectual. Now, so far as the arts are interesting, because back during the Depression, artists started using their art to make political statements. The U.S. government and corporations didn't like this because they were often on the bad end of this. So they're the ones who started the abstract art movement and started paying for all this. So my criticizing abstract art does not make me a fascist, because the origin of abstract art was in fact to try to squash people's freedom of speech. So when we talk about disdain for intellectuals in the arts, you really have to define what is meant by intellectuals in the arts. Hitler loved art, and he supported artists as much as he could. I'm not sure how much Mussolini supported the arts, although there was some art that came out of Italy during that time. Okay, what else? Obsession with crime and punishment. That one's sort of a hard one to judge. Punishment generally means... punishment was a great way to enforce fascism. So when you say obsession with punishment, are we talking about justice and punishment? Or are we talking about putting people down who disagree with me, and this very fluid definition of justice, punishing my enemies? And that's, I would agree that yes, an obsession with punishment, the obsession with crime would be accusing your enemies of crimes. But, I wouldn't say it is an obsession with crime and punishment so much as a misuse of crime and punishment. Rampant cronyism and corruption. Agree with this one. In fact, like I was just saying about crimes and punishment, is my cronies and corruption. Corruption and cronyism is my friends can do whatever they want, and it's not a crime. They won't be punished for it. You step out of line and you'll go to jail, even though there isn't a law written for what you just did. So you could almost combine those two into one point. And then the last one, fraudulent elections, which I agree and disagree on. Because initially, when the fascists took power, they did not have to rely on fraudulent elections. Like I said, unity. We stick together, work together, we will solve your problems. People wanted that. They voted for them. It wasn't until after the election that they found out, oh, your definition of unity was do what we say or else. And so, initially speaking, back at the beginning, fascists didn't necessarily have to rely on fraudulent elections. Once fascists get in power, then I wouldn't say fraudulent, rigged elections or very limited elections. They don't necessarily have to be fraudulent. They just have to be non-open. Saying I got 100% of the vote is not a fraud if I was the only person on the ballot. You might say that's not a true election or a true democracy, but it's not fraudulent. I'm very open that I'm the only person on the ballot. So one other thing about fascism, like I said, fascism is a form of dictatorship. I gave, like in my analysis here, I gave it a very specific definition. Um, so if I were to raise a private army and overthrow the government of the United States, that wouldn't necessarily be fascism. I never promised unity. Yeah, I'm still squashing people under my thumb. I'm still a dictator, but I never promised unity. I never gave these false promises of unity. That's, in my mind, when we look at accusations of fascism today, it's not just, oh, this person, he's showing an opinion that I don't like. It is, you're calling for unity, and unity means agree or else. And when you look at it that way, most of the people accusing other people of being fascism are the bigger fascists, in my opinion. Went a bit long on this video, sort of a heavy topic, and I was reading a lot from someone else's research. So, sorry if it went too long for you, but that's all I had to say. Thank you and have a good day.